In the winter of 1895, a county sheriff found 17 steps carved into solid rock, each one stained with dried blood that formed perfect handprints. The steps led down to a root cellar beneath the Ashwood family homestead in Bleakwood Hollow, Tennessee. Sheriff Clayton Morse discovered the carved stairway on January 15, 1896, after neighbors reported hearing screams that lasted 3 straight nights. The Ashwood patriarch, Jeremiah, had built his compound on 400 acres of rocky wasteland, far from any church or trading post. Tell us in the comments your city and the exact time on your clock right now. How many children were buried in that cellar before anyone found the blood-stained steps? Jeremiah Ashwood arrived in Bleakwood Hollow with his pregnant wife Constance and immediately began construction of what locals called the fortress. He dug 7 wells across his property, each one exactly 4 feet deep. The wells formed a perfect circle around the main house, and Jeremiah claimed they would protect his bloodline from outside contamination. The first child born in the compound was Rebecca, delivered during a blizzard that trapped the family for 6 weeks. Jeremiah delivered the baby himself, using only a leather strap and a hunting knife that he never cleaned afterward. The knife still carried the metallic scent of birth and blood when investigators found it decades later. Rebecca grew up believing the outside world had ended in fire and plague. Jeremiah told his children that God had chosen their family to preserve the pure bloodline of Adam. He homeschooled them using only one book, a family Bible with pages torn out and rewritten in his own hand. When Rebecca turned 14, Jeremiah announced her engagement to her brother Thomas, who was 16. The wedding ceremony took place in the compound's chapel, a single room with 3 wooden crosses carved from oak trees. 7 family members witnessed the union, each one holding a lit candle throughout the entire service. The marriage bed was a straw mattress in the cellar, surrounded by the 17 carved steps. Jeremiah had carved each step during Rebecca's childhood, adding one each year to mark her growth toward womanhood. The walls around the bed were covered with Bible verses about the purity of blood and the sin of mixing with strangers. Rebecca became pregnant within 2 months of the wedding. Her body, still developing, could not handle the strain of carrying her brother's child. She vomited blood every morning, and her teeth began falling out before she reached her 5th month. The metallic scent of birth and blood filled the cellar permanently after she moved downstairs. Jeremiah refused to allow any outside help during the pregnancy. He claimed that doctors were agents of Satan, sent to corrupt pure bloodlines with foreign medicine. Instead, he forced Rebecca to drink a mixture of well water and crushed herbs that he gathered from the forest surrounding the compound. Thomas watched his sister wife grow weaker each day, but Jeremiah had trained him from birth to never question divine will. The young man spent hours carving additional symbols into the cellar walls, trying to pray away his growing doubts about their sacred mission. His hands bled from gripping the carving knife too tightly, but he never stopped working. The other children in the compound began showing signs of severe malnutrition as Jeremiah devoted all resources to preparing for the holy birth. The youngest son, Matthew, developed rickets so severe that his legs could no longer support his weight. The family's food stores dwindled to nothing but dried corn and well water. Rebecca's labor lasted 4 days and 3 nights. Her screams echoed through the 17 carved steps and reached the main house, where the other children huddled together in terror. Jeremiah declared that her suffering was necessary to purify the bloodline and prepare the child for its sacred destiny. The baby was born on October 31st, 1895, during a thunderstorm that knocked down 3 of the oak trees surrounding the compound. The infant's head was severely deformed, with eyes that never opened and limbs that twisted at impossible angles. Jeremiah claimed the deformities were divine markings that proved the child's holy status. Rebecca died 6 hours after giving birth, her body finally succumbing to months of malnutrition and the trauma of an impossible delivery. Thomas wrapped her in a quilt, their mother had sewn. But Jeremiah ordered him to leave the body in the cellar next to their living child. The metallic scent of birth and blood grew stronger with each passing day. The deformed infant lived for 8 months, requiring constant care that the family could not provide. Its twisted limbs prevented normal movement, and its sealed eyes wept constantly. Jeremiah interpreted every cry as a divine message and spent hours kneeling beside the child, claiming to receive prophecies about the future of their bloodline. Thomas began sleepwalking through the compound at night, often found standing at the edge of the 17 carved steps, staring down into the cellar where his sister wife had died. The other family members avoided him, afraid that his grief had driven him insane. His mother Constance tried to comfort him, but Jeremiah forbade any discussion of worldly sorrow. During the harsh winter of 1895, the compound's food supplies ran out completely. The family survived by eating tree bark and drinking melted snow mixed with dirt from the 7 wells. Several children developed scurvy, and their teeth began falling out, just as Rebecca's had during her pregnancy. The deformed infant stopped crying in March of 1896, its small body finally giving up the struggle for survival. Jeremiah declared that the child had ascended to heaven and commanded the family to preserve its body as a sacred relic. He wrapped the infant in white cloth and placed it in a wooden box carved with religious symbols. Thomas could not accept his child's death as divine will. He began questioning Jeremiah's teachings for the first time, asking why God would allow such suffering if their bloodline was truly blessed. Jeremiah responded by ordering the other family members to treat Thomas as a heretic and refuse him food or shelter. The breaking point came when neighbors noticed smoke from the compound's chimney had stopped appearing during the coldest part of winter. A local pastor, concerned about the family's welfare, organized a group of men to check on the Ashwoods. They found the main house empty, except for scattered papers and religious symbols carved into every wooden surface. Sheriff Morse arrived 3 days later and discovered the 17 carved steps leading down to the cellar. The blood-stained handprints on each step told the story of Rebecca's final descent to give birth and die. At the bottom of the stairs, he found her skeletal remains still wrapped in the quilt, alongside the wooden box containing her child's preserved body. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic isolation and religious extremism that had lasted for over a decade. Medical experts who examined the infant's remains confirmed that severe genetic abnormalities had made survival impossible from birth. The child's deformities were consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding within a closed family system. No trace of the surviving family members was ever found, despite extensive searches throughout Tennessee and neighboring states. Some locals reported seeing covered wagons traveling through mountain passes during the weeks following the discovery, but these sightings were never confirmed. The metallic scent of birth and blood lingered in the abandoned cellar for months after the investigation concluded. The Ashwood compound slowly returned to wilderness as nature reclaimed the buildings and wells. The 17 carved steps became overgrown with moss and vines, and the 7 wells filled with fallen leaves and rainwater. Local children dared each other to approach the ruins, but few were brave enough to descend the blood-stained steps. Years later, when historians studied the case, they found evidence that similar isolated communities had existed throughout the remote mountain regions of Tennessee. These families often shared common religious beliefs about bloodline purity and the corruption of the outside world. The Ashwood case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme isolation and fundamentalist interpretation of religious texts. The abandoned homestead changed hands several times over the following decades, but no family ever lived there for more than a few months. Each new owner reported strange occurrences: tools that moved by themselves, the sound of crying from the sealed cellar, and the persistent metallic scent that seemed to emanate from the 17 carved steps. Medical researchers later used the Ashwood case to study the genetic consequences of prolonged inbreeding within isolated populations. The infants' preserved remains provided valuable data about chromosomal abnormalities that result from sibling reproduction over multiple generations. The research helped establish guidelines for genetic counseling in rural communities where isolation might lead to similar tragedies. Local churches throughout the region began implementing new policies to identify and assist isolated families before religious extremism could take root. The Ashwood tragedy sparked conversations about the balance between religious freedom and child protection that continued for decades after the discovery of the blood-stained steps. The 7 wells that Jeremiah had dug to protect his bloodline were eventually filled with concrete by county officials, who declared them a public safety hazard. However, locals still avoided the property, claiming that the ground itself had been cursed by the suffering that occurred there. Real estate records show that the land remained unsold for over 30 years. Archaeological surveys of the compound in later decades revealed additional burial sites beyond the main cellar. The remains of several infants were found buried in shallow graves around the property, suggesting that Rebecca and Thomas were not the only siblings forced into reproductive relationships. Each burial site contained small wooden tokens carved with religious symbols. When spring arrived that year, neighboring farmers began noticing vultures circling the Ashwood property daily. The birds would land near the compound's main buildings, then take flight again without feeding. This pattern continued for weeks, suggesting the presence of death, but not fresh carrion. Local hunters who tracked game near the property boundaries reported an overwhelming stench that kept wildlife away from the entire 400-acre tract. Pastor William Henley of the Bleakwood Methodist Church had attempted to visit the Ashwood family multiple times over the previous 2 years. Each visit ended at the compound's front gate, where Jeremiah would appear with a loaded shotgun and claim his family was observing religious isolation. The pastor noted in his personal journal that Jeremiah's appearance had changed dramatically over time, describing him as gaunt as a scarecrow, with eyes that burned like coals. The first concrete evidence of the family's dire situation came from Tobias Fletcher, a traveling merchant who sold supplies to remote homesteads throughout the region. Fletcher had previously conducted regular business with the Ashwoods, but his last successful transaction occurred in autumn of 1894. When he returned the following spring, Jeremiah met him at the gate and claimed the family no longer needed outside goods because God was providing everything they required. Fletcher observed that Jeremiah had lost at least 50 pounds since their previous meeting. The merchant also noticed that several children who used to wave from the compound's windows were no longer visible. When Fletcher asked about the missing children, Jeremiah's response was that some family members had been called to serve in Heaven's army. The cryptic answer troubled Fletcher enough that he reported his concerns to Sheriff Morse. Inside the compound during those final months, the surviving family members had developed a rigid hierarchy based on Jeremiah's interpretation of divine favor. Thomas, despite being Rebecca's husband, had fallen to the bottom of this hierarchy after questioning the sacred nature of his child's deformities. He was forbidden from entering the main house and forced to sleep in one of the empty animal stalls. Constance Ashwood, Jeremiah's wife and mother of the children, had begun showing signs of severe mental distress. She spent hours each day combing her daughter's hair, even though Rebecca had been dead for months. Constance would sit beside the skeletal remains in the cellar, braiding rotted strands that crumbled between her fingers, while singing lullabies that echoed through the 17 carved steps. The younger children had formed their own survival system within the compound's walls. Matthew, despite his rickets, had become the group's leader by virtue of being able to find edible roots and berries around the property. His sister Sarah, only 12 years old, had taken responsibility for rationing their meager food supplies and determining which family members would eat each day. Jeremiah's religious services had evolved into marathon sessions, lasting 8 to 12 hours. He would force the entire family to kneel on the cellar's stone floor while he delivered sermons about the approaching end times and their role as the chosen remnant. The metallic scent of birth and blood made these gatherings almost unbearable, but any family member who complained was denied food for 3 days. During these extended services, Jeremiah would hold the preserved infant above his head and claim to receive divine messages through its twisted form. He declared that the child's deformities were actually angelic markings, and that its death had opened a direct communication channel to heaven. The other children were forced to kiss the infant's preserved hands. While reciting prayers Jeremiah had written himself. The compound's infrastructure began failing during the brutal winter months. The well water became contaminated with runoff from the makeshift latrines Jeremiah had dug too close to the water sources. 3 of the 7 wells developed a greenish scum that made the water undrinkable, but Jeremiah declared this contamination was a test of faith and ordered the family to drink it anyway. Thomas had discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath loose floorboards in the main house. The letters, written by Jeremiah before Rebekah's birth, revealed his plans to create what he called the pure bloodline through selective breeding within the family. The correspondence showed that Jeremiah had been planning sibling marriages for over 15 years, viewing his children as breeding stock rather than human beings. The letters also revealed that Constance had initially opposed Jeremiah's plans, threatening to leave the compound with the children. Jeremiah's response had been to destroy all roads connecting their property to the outside world and post armed guards to prevent anyone from leaving. The letters detailed his belief that God had specifically chosen him to preserve humanity's original genetic purity through controlled reproduction. Matthew discovered his father's ultimate plan while searching for food in the compound's storage areas. Hidden beneath sacks of rotting grain, he found detailed genealogical charts showing how Jeremiah intended to pair each child with their siblings over multiple generations. The charts indicated that Rebekah and Thomas were only the beginning of a systematic breeding program designed to create what Jeremiah called God's perfect race. Sarah had been designated as Thomas's next wife after Rebekah's death, despite being only 12 years old. The charts showed that Matthew would eventually be paired with his youngest sister once she reached puberty. Every possible genetic combination within the family had been calculated and planned, with Jeremiah serving as the ultimate authority over all reproductive decisions. The discovery of these charts sparked the first open rebellion within the compound. Matthew and Sarah convinced Thomas to help them escape during one of Jeremiah's extended prayer sessions. They planned to flee during the early morning hours, when Jeremiah would be unconscious from exhaustion after preaching all night in the cellar. Their escape attempt failed when Constance discovered them preparing to leave and alerted Jeremiah. In his fury, Jeremiah ordered Thomas to be chained in the cellar beside Rebekah's remains as punishment for corrupting the younger children with thoughts of abandoning God's plan. The chains were attached to iron rings Jeremiah had previously installed in the stone walls, suggesting he had anticipated the need to restrain family members. The punishment served as a warning to the other children about the consequences of disobedience. Jeremiah forced them to watch as Thomas was chained next to his dead wife's skeleton, with the preserved infant placed on his lap. The psychological torture was designed to break any remaining resistance to Jeremiah's authority and demonstrate the price of questioning divine will. During Thomas's imprisonment in the cellar, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He began conversations with Rebekah's skeletal remains, asking for forgiveness and begging her to explain why God had allowed their child to suffer. The other family members could hear his voice echoing up through the 17 carved steps at all hours of the day and night. Sheriff Morse's investigation later revealed that Jeremiah had been in correspondence with other isolated religious communities throughout the mountain region. These letters, found scattered throughout the compound, showed that similar breeding programs were being discussed and potentially implemented in at least 3 other locations. The network of extremist families had been sharing information about bloodline purity and genetic selection for over a decade. The letters also contained references to a planned gathering of all the pure bloodline families, scheduled to take place during the summer of 1896. The gathering was intended to be a mass wedding ceremony, where children from different compounds would be paired for reproduction, expanding the genetic pool while maintaining religious purity. Maps found in Jeremiah's personal effects showed meeting locations throughout the Tennessee mountains. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who examined the infant's remains during the official investigation, documented genetic abnormalities consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding. His medical report noted severe cranial deformities, spinal bifida, and organ development that would have made survival impossible beyond infancy. The doctor's findings contradicted Jeremiah's claims about divine markings and angelic features. The wooden box containing the deformed infant's remains was eventually transferred to Vanderbilt Medical College for research purposes, where it remained for several decades before being quietly buried in an unmarked grave. The college's records from that period show unusual interest from researchers studying genetic abnormalities in isolated populations throughout the rural South. During the final weeks before the compound was discovered, several dramatic changes occurred within the family structure. Constance had stopped eating entirely, claiming that earthly food was preventing her from joining Rebecca in heaven. She would spend entire days lying next to her daughter's remains, growing weaker as she refused all nourishment and care from the surviving children. Jeremiah's behavior became increasingly erratic as he realized his divine plan was failing. He would alternate between periods of violent rage, during which he would destroy furniture and religious artifacts, and episodes of catatonic depression, where he would stare at the cellar walls for hours without speaking or moving. The remaining children learned to hide when these mood swings occurred. The metallic scent of birth and blood had permeated every building on the compound by this time, making normal life impossible. Even the well water carried the odor, and clothing that had been stored in the main house retained the smell permanently. The stench was so overwhelming that it could be detected from several hundred yards away from the property boundaries. Matthew had assumed leadership of the surviving children during the final months, organizing scavenging expeditions to find edible plants and small animals around the property. His rickets made walking painful, but he pushed himself to continue searching for food while avoiding Jeremiah's increasingly unpredictable supervision. The younger children depended on his efforts for their survival. Sarah had begun experiencing the physical changes of puberty, which terrified her because she understood what Jeremiah had planned for her future. She would bind her developing body with strips of cloth torn from old clothing, hoping to delay the moment when Jeremiah would declare her ready for marriage to Thomas. Her attempts to hide her maturation created additional psychological stress for the entire family. The final tragedy occurred when Constance died of starvation in the cellar beside her daughter's remains. Jeremiah declared her death a sacred ascension and ordered the children to leave her body where it had fallen. He claimed that mother and daughter were now serving together in heaven's army, and that disturbing their earthly forms would prevent their souls from completing divine missions. Thomas, still chained in the cellar, was forced to remain next to both sets of remains, while Jeremiah conducted increasingly long religious ceremonies around the bodies. The psychological trauma of this situation, combined with months of malnutrition and physical abuse, left Thomas in a state of complete mental collapse. He stopped speaking entirely and would only respond to direct commands. When Sheriff Morse finally gained access to the compound, he found evidence of the family's desperate final weeks scattered throughout the buildings. Crude drawings on the walls showed children's attempts to record their experiences, including images of the preserved infant and the chained figure of Thomas in the cellar. These drawings provided investigators with crucial evidence about the family's final months. The investigation revealed additional burial sites around the compound that had not been immediately apparent. Ground-penetrating equipment located the remains of at least 6 infants buried in shallow graves around the property's perimeter. Each burial site contained handmade wooden tokens carved with religious symbols, suggesting that Rebecca and Thomas were not the first siblings forced into reproductive relationships. Despite extensive documentation of the case, questions remained about how the Ashwood family's extreme practices had developed and persisted for so long without outside intervention. The family's isolation was so complete that neighbors had no idea what was happening behind the compound's boundaries until it was too late to prevent the tragedy. The 17 carved steps remain visible today, though they are now protected by a chain-link fence installed by the county to prevent trespassing. Visitors to the site report that the bloodstains are still visible on certain steps, despite decades of weather exposure. Local historians have preserved photographs of the steps and the carved symbols found throughout the compound. Until today, nobody knows if the story of the Ashwood family really happened, or if it's just a rural legend passed down from generation to generation among the isolated communities of the Tennessee mountains. The lesson remains clear. Extreme isolation combined with religious fundamentalism can create conditions where the most vulnerable members of a family become victims of those who claim to protect them. What do you think? Was this a real tragedy that shook rural Tennessee, or just mountain folklore designed to warn against the dangers of isolation? Share your thoughts in the comments below.